They do not break down because they understand your pain. They often break down when they can no longer control your reaction to it. That is the shift most people miss. And once you see it, a lot of confusing moments start making sense very fast. Maybe you spent years trying to explain your hurt in the clearest words possible. Maybe you waited for that one moment when they would finally look at the damage, go quiet, and feel real regret. But that moment usually never comes in the way you hoped. Real remorse needs something very specific. It needs the ability to sit with the fact that they caused harm, feel the discomfort without escaping from it, and let that discomfort change what they do next. That is the piece that is often missing. So when tears show up, it is easy to read them as guilt, but most of the time they are being produced by a completely different engine. Stay with me, because this is where the whole picture changes. The tears are usually tied to one of two things. Either they are losing control of the situation, or they are losing the emotional attention they have been feeding on. That is why the crying can look so dramatic and still lead nowhere. It can look deep and still change nothing. And if you have ever thought, why now? Why after all this time? This is probably the answer. It was not your pain finally reaching them. It was the old system no longer working the way it used to. Loss of control is one of the strongest triggers. Things stop following the script they expected. Maybe they were sure you would panic, defend yourself, explain, or beg to be understood. Maybe they expected guilt to pull you back in. Maybe they counted on fear, but instead you stayed steady. Or someone else noticed what happened and did not excuse it. In that moment, the emotional reaction you see is often not about the harm done to you at all. It is about the shock of the pattern not working. Loss of supply works the same way. If your distress, your attention, your constant emotional engagement stops flowing, they can feel that immediately. That old stream of proof dries up. The tears that appear then are often more like protest than reflection. It is a pull to get the dynamic running again. And there is another layer people miss. Crying can flip the center of gravity in the room. 1 second you are talking about what happened to you. The next second they are crying, their voice is shaking, and somehow the focus moves on to their pain. Now you are no longer discussing the broken promise, the insult, the betrayal, or the manipulation. Now you are managing their feelings. That shift is everything. It happens fast. So fast that many people do not even realize the conversation has been stolen until it is already over. You did not fail to make your point. The floor was simply taken from under you. And if you have lived this cycle enough times, you know how disorienting it feels. You finally see the tears you thought would mean something, and yet nothing solid follows. No lasting apology, no real repair, no real change. One of the clearest places to see this pattern is in the difference between private harm and public exposure. Pay attention to that gap. When they hurt you in private, there may be no visible discomfort at all. Sometimes there is not even basic acknowledgement. They move on, they minimize it, they act like nothing happened. But when the same behavior is seen by another person, named out loud, or brought into the open where their image is at risk, the reaction can become intense very quickly. That tells you something important. If the pain they cause does not create the breakdown, but being seen causing the pain does, then the distress is not coming from conscience. It is coming from threat. Threat to image, threat to status, threat to the version of themselves they work hard to protect. And that version can be far more fragile than it looks. From the outside, it may seem solid, confident, even larger than life. But underneath, it often depends on constant reinforcement. The right audience, the right story, the right emotional mirror. So when a crack appears in that image, the response can be huge. Sometimes desperate, sometimes theatrical, sometimes so convincing that even you start wondering if this is finally the breakthrough. But look closely. There is usually a story attached. They are misunderstood. They are overwhelmed. They are the real victim. They were pushed too far. They were unfairly judged. The tears and the story often arrive together because both are part of the same move. It is not just emotion, it is narrative control. And once you understand that, you stop reading every collapse as change. Sometimes a collapse is just the system protecting itself. This is why pulling back often works where confrontation never did. Most interactions in these dynamics are not really about solving a problem. They are running a quiet test. Does this still affect you? Do they still have access to your emotions? Can they still pull fear, guilt, anger, confusion, or urgency out of you on demand? Every sharp remark, every baiting comment, every false crisis can function like a probe. And if you react, even in understandable pain, the answer they get is yes. Your anger tells them they still land. Your tears tell them they still matter. Even long silence can still feed the loop if the silence is charged, if it is built around them, if it is waiting for them to notice. What interrupts the pattern is not dramatic silence. It is real reduction of emotional charge, low-key detachment, plain steadiness, no performance, no theater, no visible hook. And when that happens, the relationship does not usually become peaceful right away. It often gets louder first. This part catches many people off guard. The moment the old feedback loop weakens, the system often pushes harder. Bigger provocations, sharper guilt trips, sudden softness, sudden tears, unexpected vulnerability, a message that sounds almost sincere, a story about how broken they are, a crisis that lands at the exact moment you are becoming calm. It can look random, but it is usually the old loop trying to restore itself. So if you are watching for the point where withdrawal makes everything instantly quiet, you may think it is not working, but the early escalation is often proof that something important has changed. Stay here. This part matters more than people realize. That escalation phase is usually the hardest part to survive without slipping back into the old role. Because once direct reactions stop working, other people may get pulled in. A friend may suddenly contact you saying everyone is worried. A family member may repeat a strange version of events that makes your distance look cruel. Someone who never seemed involved before now has a strong opinion. This is not accidental. When the direct line weakens, pressure may come from the sides. And that can feel deeply unsettling because now you are not just dealing with one person. You are dealing with a story that is spreading around you. The urge at that point is to explain everything to everyone, to clear your name, to tell the whole history, to make sure people finally understand what really happened. But this is where many people get pulled back into the same exhausting loop under a new shape. You start defending yourself in 10 directions at once, and suddenly the entire system is alive again. What makes withdrawal powerful is that it offers very little material to work with. No fight to win, no emotional performance to twist, no long speech to quote against you later. It is like trying to push against a door that is no longer there. And that emptiness can be more destabilizing than argument, but it only works if it is paired with steadiness, not icy punishment. If your distance is really just a way to provoke, they can feel the charge in it. Genuine withdrawal is different. It is quieter, less dramatic, more grounded. It comes from a place where their reaction is no longer the center of your nervous system. That is much harder to fake than people think. And it is why true detachment changes the atmosphere in a way words usually cannot. People often use the phrase gray rock to describe this kind of approach, but many apply it too literally. They turn it into a stiff performance of blankness, a flat mask that still hums with resentment under the surface. And if the resentment is still active, the charge is still active too. The more effective version is simpler and deeper. It is not about becoming robotic. It is about deciding quietly that not every comment deserves access to your body, your thoughts, your whole day. It is about narrowing what gets to matter. It is about learning that their opinion of you is not useful information you must keep collecting in order to feel steady. That shift becomes even more important when reality starts getting rewritten. Because one of the most disorienting parts of these dynamics is how quickly events can be reshaped after they happen. A conversation that felt obvious at the time gets retold later in a completely different way. You are recast as the unstable one, the aggressor, the selfish one, the unreasonable one. Sometimes this is deliberate. Sometimes it looks automatic, like reality itself keeps bending to protect the same self-image. Either way, the effect on you is the same. You begin to doubt your memory. You begin to question your own read of the room. You start wondering if maybe you really were too harsh, too sensitive, too much. That is why keeping a simple record matters so much. Not to build a case, not to plan revenge, not to prepare the perfect future argument, but to keep hold of what actually happened. A note on your phone, the date, the words used, the sequence, what was said, what was done. No drama, no theory, just the facts, written while they are still fresh. That kind of record can become an anchor when everything else starts to blur. And that record does more than protect your memory. It protects your trust in yourself. Because confusion is often one of the most effective tools in the whole pattern. A person who is not sure what happened becomes easier to move, easier to blame, easier to exhaust. When you can quietly return to a clear account of what really took place, you stop depending on their version of reality to feel stable. That changes something deep. Over time, clarity starts doing for you what apologies never did. It gives you ground. It gives you continuity. It gives you a place to stand even when the story around you keeps shifting. There is another truth underneath all of this that explains why accurate observation can provoke such a strong reaction. Under the charm, the self-importance, the need for attention, the constant management of image, there is often a powerful fear of being seen clearly, not seen as imperfect in the normal human sense. Everyone can tolerate that. But seen in a way that exposes the gap between the polished version and the actual pattern, that is a different kind of threat. If their identity depends heavily on being admired, believed, excused, or viewed as special, then calm, specific truth can feel more dangerous than shouting ever could. If you call them evil in a dramatic way, it is easy for them to dismiss it as exaggeration. But if you calmly name a real pattern, how they redirect every conversation back to themselves, how they punish withdrawal, how they need admiration and control, how they reverse blame when held accountable, that can land much harder because it is close to something real. The reaction is often strongest not when the statement is the harshest, but when it is the most accurate. That is why calm clarity can feel so much more unsettling to them than emotional outrage. This is also why outrage so often backfires. In most relationships, anger can be a clear signal that a line has been crossed. It can create urgency. It can force attention onto the issue. But in these dynamics, anger often becomes raw material. It gets reframed as instability. It gets used as proof that you are the problem. It gives them tone to attack, intensity to focus on, drama to hide behind. The original issue disappears, and suddenly the whole exchange is about your reaction instead of their behavior. A calm boundary, on the other hand, offers very little to grab. If you say plainly that a specific behavior is not acceptable and explain what you will do if it continues, there is no emotional fog to hide inside, no explosion to point at, no chaos to turn into a side story. The limit just sits there, clean, boring even, and that boredom is part of its power, because boundaries that really hold are not built to create a scene. They are built to protect you whether a scene happens or not. They do not depend on being understood in the moment. They do not require the other person to agree, approve, or suddenly grow insight. They only require that you mean what you say. And that is where the real work usually is. Not in crafting the perfect sentence, not in sounding tougher, but in getting to a place where you are willing to let the action carry the truth without endless explanation behind it. That kind of steadiness is deeply unsettling to a person who expects the usual cycle of provocation, reaction, confusion, and repair attempt. It removes the stage, it removes the role, it removes the noise, and without the noise, the old strategies have much less room to breathe. If you want to understand what is really driving someone in a given moment, stop watching for the thing that should upset them and start watching for the thing that actually does. That gap tells the whole story. You may calmly explain that something they said hurt you and they barely react. A shrug, a quick denial, a pivot to something else, almost nothing. But then a few minutes later, someone questions their competence in front of others, or they are not given the spotlight they expected, or a plan slips beyond their control, and suddenly the reaction is huge, disproportionate, sharp, emotional. That mismatch matters. It shows you what system is active. This is not a system mainly organized around empathy for your pain. It is organized around image, status, control, relevance. And once you see that, something painful but freeing becomes clear. No matter how perfectly you describe your hurt, you may never be able to trigger the response you were hoping for because the internal wiring is not set up to receive that information in the way you need. That does not mean your pain is unclear. It does not mean you did not explain it well enough. It does not mean you failed to choose the right words. It means you may be standing in front of a door that never opened in that direction. That reframe matters because it moves the burden off your effort. It stops turning the whole thing into a puzzle you just have not solved yet. And when that happens, you begin to judge progress differently. You stop asking, did they cry? Did they look affected? Did they seem upset? And start asking, did the behavior actually change? Did the change last? Did it hold when things got hard? Reaction is not the same as understanding. It never was. And learning that can save years. Of all the shifts that change the dynamic most, indifference is usually the hardest for the other person to tolerate. Not fake indifference, not icy distance while secretly waiting to be chased. Real indifference, real emotional release. Because for a long time, your reactions may have been serving as proof. Proof that they mattered, proof that they had reach, proof that they could still alter your internal weather whenever they chose. Your hurt proved it, your anger proved it, even your hope proved it. Your efforts to be seen, to be understood, to fix things, to finally make them get it, all of that still kept your emotional attention circling around them. But indifference gives none of that back. It is a mirror that stops reflecting. And that can feel shocking from their side, not just like rejection, but like disappearance of influence. That is why real emotional detachment often pulls a bigger response than conflict ever did. The old mirror goes dark, and with it goes a form of confirmation they had come to rely on. But here's the difficult part. You cannot fake this well for long. Performed calm still leaks hope. Forced silence still leaks pain. If you are still waiting under the surface for the apology, the regret, the moment they finally see you, that charge can still be felt. Real detachment is slower. It usually comes from 100 small moments, not one grand decision. You notice yourself not explaining this time, not checking for their reaction, not replaying the conversation all night, not needing the answer, one moment, then another, and months later, you realize your sense of peace is no longer rising and falling on their moods. That is when the shift becomes real. Once that happens, the attempts to pull you back often intensify before they fade. This is where people get confused and think the old closeness is returning. A sweet message arrives out of nowhere. A memory is mentioned at the perfect time. There is sudden softness, a strange vulnerability, an apology that sounds closer to sincere than anything you have heard before. A crisis that demands your warmth right when you had finally become steady. It can look meaningful. It can feel moving. And sometimes it is not fully conscious on their part. It may simply be the old pattern reaching for the thing that used to work. But whether calculated or automatic, the function is often the same. It pulls you back toward the loop, back toward hope, back toward emotional labor, back toward interpretation. That is why it is so important to judge change by consistency, not intensity, not by how emotional the moment looks, not by how dramatic the tears are, not by how convincing the message sounds at midnight, but by whether behavior changes in a way that holds over time, under stress, without needing an audience, without collapsing the moment your boundaries stay firm. If the pattern returns the second your stability returns, then the moment was not repair. It was retrieval. And seeing that clearly changes everything. It allows you to stop chasing the one reaction you thought would heal the whole story. It lets you step out of the exhausting search for proof that they finally understand. Sometimes what sets you free is not the moment they break down. It is the moment you realize their breakdown was never the answer. The answer is your clarity, your steadiness, your record of reality, your calm boundary, your refusal to keep offering emotional fuel to a system that only wakes up when it feels its control slipping. That is the shift, quiet, deep. And once it happens, the script stops belonging to them.